Welcome to the store. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me.
John wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands rough and calloused from the day's labor. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting a golden light over the village fields. He had worked these fields his entire life, just like his father before him, and his father's father before that. For generations, they had tilled the earth, planting seeds, harvesting crops, and enduring the quiet, simple life of farmers, but John always longed for more. He often caught himself staring at the distant mountains, their dark silhouettes looming over the horizon, mysterious and full of untold secrets. His father, who always noticed the far-off look in his eyes, would tell him, "The world out there isn't what you think it is, boy. There's danger in those lands. Best to keep your feet grounded here, where it's safe." And yet, there was a pull, a quiet whisper in the back of John's mind. It was as if something was waiting for him out there, something beyond the routine of planting and harvesting. One fateful evening, after finishing the day's chores, John ventured farther than usual into the woods behind the village. The dense trees cast long shadows, their trunks twisted and gnarled with age. Birds fluttered between the branches, but the deeper he went, the quieter it became. Soon, only the soft rustle of leaves underfoot accompanied him. His curiosity led him to an area of the woods that even the hunters avoided, a place whispered about in village tales. An old ruin, long abandoned and overgrown with vines and moss, stood in the clearing before him. John's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard stories of this place, stories of strange happenings and ancient relics. As he approached the crumbled remains of what once might have been a grand temple, he felt an odd sensation, like the air itself was heavier. In the center of the ruin stood a stone pedestal, partially hidden by fallen rubble. And resting on that pedestal was a sword. It wasn't like any sword John had ever seen. The blade shimmered faintly, reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. Its hilt was adorned with intricate designs that seemed to pulse with life. The sword was ancient, yet untouched by time, as if waiting for someone, or something. John hesitated, but his feet carried him forward. As he reached out, his fingers barely brushing the hilt, the sword seemed to hum, a quiet resonance that echoed deep within his bones. When he finally wrapped his hand around it, a surge of power shot through him, sending a shockwave that rippled through the air. His heart raced. This was the Sword of the Stars. The ancient weapon of legend. The stories had always spoken of it as the most powerful weapon in existence, forged in a time when darkness threatened to consume the world. Only the chosen could wield it, they said. John had never believed in such tales, until now. The weight of the sword felt right in his hand, balanced, like it had been crafted for him. But as the energy coursed through him, it was not just power he felt. It was responsibility. He knew, deep down, that his life would never be the same again. The next few days passed in a blur. John returned to his village, but he kept the sword hidden. He wasn't sure how to explain what had happened, or if anyone would even believe him. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. And he was right. It started with whispers. The villagers spoke of a dark presence, shadows moving in the night, and livestock disappearing without a trace. John's father, ever the pragmatist, dismissed the rumors as the result of overactive imaginations. But John knew better. He could feel it, the same dark energy he had sensed in the woods when he found the sword. Then, one evening, they came. Dark figures, cloaked and hooded, descended upon the village. They moved silently, their eyes glowing a sickly green in the moonlight. John barely had time to react before the first house was set aflame, its fiery glow casting long shadows over the terrified villagers. John's heart pounded as he ran toward the commotion, the sword hidden beneath his cloak. The village was in chaos, people running in every direction, screaming for help. The dark figures, creatures of the dark forces, no doubt, moved with purpose, their eerie green eyes scanning the streets as they searched for something. They were searching for him. Without thinking, John drew the sword of the stars. The moment the blade was exposed to the night air, it glowed brightly, casting a brilliant light that cut through the darkness. The creatures froze, their attention snapping to John. He felt their gaze, heavy and cold, as if they were peering into his very soul. One of them, taller than the rest, stepped forward. His hood fell back, revealing a face twisted with malice and dark magic. His voice was a low growl. "So, the sword has chosen another fool." John gripped the hilt tighter, his heart racing. He had never been in a real fight before, let alone against creatures like these. But the sword seemed to guide him, its weight steady in his hand. With a swift motion, the creature lunged at John, its clawed hand outstretched. John dodged instinctively, bringing the sword up in an arc. The blade connected, slicing through the creature's arm as if it were air. The creature howled in pain, green energy leaking from the wound like blood, but John knew he couldn't fight them all. The village was in danger, and if he stayed, more lives would be lost. He had to draw them away. With a quick glance back at his home, John took off running, the dark figures hot on his heels. The sword pulsed with energy as he ran, its glow lighting the path ahead. He led the creatures deep into the woods, where the trees grew thick and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. John skidded to a stop in a clearing, turning to face his pursuers. They emerged from the shadows, their green eyes glowing brighter as they encircled him. The tall one sneered, his wounded arm dangling at his side. "You cannot hope to defeat us, boy. The sword may have chosen you, but you are nothing without it." John's mind raced. He knew he couldn't rely solely on the sword. He had to outthink them, use his surroundings to his advantage. As the creatures closed in, John moved swiftly, darting between the trees and using the sword's light to blind them momentarily. He set traps, leading them into pitfalls and using the terrain to trip them up. Slowly, one by one, the creatures fell, either wounded or trapped, until only the tall one remained. Breathing heavily, John faced the leader once more. "You underestimate me," he said, gripping the sword tightly. The creature laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. "We shall see." In a flash, the creature lunged at him again, but this time, John was ready. He sidestepped the attack, swinging the sword with all his strength. The blade sliced clean through the creature, its body disintegrating into black smoke as it fell. John stood there, panting, the sword's glow dimming as the last of the dark forces vanished. He had won. But the victory felt hollow. He hadn't saved his village. He had only delayed the inevitable. John returned to the village at dawn, the sword still in hand. The fires had been extinguished, and the villagers were picking through the wreckage, salvaging what they could. His father was among them, his face etched with worry. "You're alive," his father said, relief washing over him. "We thought," John nodded, but his eyes were distant, scanning the horizon. "They'll be back," he said quietly. "And next time, they'll bring more." His father frowned. "What do you mean?" John took a deep breath. "The dark forces. They've returned. They're looking for the sword." His father's eyes widened. "The sword of the stars? You found it?" John nodded, pulling the sword from beneath his cloak. Its surface glimmered faintly in the morning light. His father stared at it for a long moment before shaking his head. "You must get rid of it, John. It will bring nothing but trouble. But John couldn't. The sword had chosen him, and whether he liked it or not, he had a responsibility now. That night, as the village slept, John sat by the fire, turning the sword over in his hands. It was a powerful weapon, that much was clear. But something gnawed at him. He had felt it in the woods, when he faced the creatures. The sword was strong, but it wasn't enough. He couldn't rely on it alone. The next morning, John made a decision. He couldn't wait for the dark forces to return. He had to be proactive. He would rally the village, unite them against the coming threat. They would have to fight, not just with swords and weapons, but with strategy and wit. John knew he couldn't do it alone. He would need allies. He would need to inspire them to work together. The sword may have been a symbol of power, but the true strength would come from unity. John rose early the next morning, a sense of purpose driving his every step. He wasn't the same farmer's son who had worked the fields and dreamed of something more. The sword had opened his eyes to the world beyond, but more importantly, it had shown him the true weight of responsibility. The dark forces were not just a distant threat, they were here, and his village was now at the center of it all. The villagers had gathered in the square by midday, murmuring among themselves. They had seen the destruction from the night before, and fear clung to them like a fog. John stood before them, sword at his side, his gaze sweeping over their anxious faces. He cleared his throat and the murmurs died down. "I won't lie to you," John began, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "We are in danger. The dark forces are real, and they are coming for us. What happened last night was only the beginning." A few gasps rippled through the crowd, but John pressed on. "But we have a choice. We can wait for them to come again, or we can prepare. We can fight back." Someone from the crowd shouted, "With what?" "We're farmers, not soldiers." John nodded, understanding their fear. "I know. But we are not powerless. I've seen the strength we have when we work together. The sword isn't enough to protect us on its own, but if we stand united, we can defend our home." There was silence for a moment, and then his childhood friend, Elena, stepped forward. Her eyes met his, filled with the same resolve he felt in his heart. "I'm with you, John." That small declaration was enough to spark something in the others. One by one, more villagers began to step forward, pledging their support. The blacksmith offered to forge weapons, while others volunteered to build defenses. John felt a swell of pride as he saw the collective strength in his people, their fear turning into determination. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. John led the villagers in fortifying their homes, digging trenches, and setting traps around the perimeter of the village. Every able-bodied man and woman trained daily, not just in combat, but in strategy. John knew brute force wouldn't win this battle, outsmarting the dark forces would. He spent hours with Elena and the blacksmith, planning their defenses, using the village's natural landscape to their advantage. The sword remained at John's side, but he kept it sheathed for most of the time. It wasn't a crutch, it was a reminder of the larger fight ahead. The dark forces would come, but they wouldn't face a defenseless village. They would face a united people, ready to stand together. As the final preparations were made, John found himself standing at the edge of the village one evening, watching the sunset. Elena approached quietly, her footsteps soft on the grass. "You've done well," she said, standing beside him. John smiled faintly, his mind still heavy with the weight of what was to come. "It's not over yet." "No," Elena agreed, "but you've given them hope. That's more than anyone else could have done." He glanced at her, appreciating her steady presence. Elena had always been the calm in the storm, ever since they were children. She had believed in him when he found the sword, and she believed in him now. "Do you think we have a chance?" John asked quietly. Elena was silent for a moment, her eyes on the horizon. "I don't know. But I do know that whatever happens, we'll face it together. That's what matters." John nodded, the tension in his chest easing just a bit. Together. That word echoed in his mind, anchoring him. Whatever came next, they were ready. The attack came on a moonless night. The air was thick with tension as John and the villagers stood ready, weapons in hand. The traps had been set, the defenses in place. All they could do now was wait. The first sign of the dark forces was the unnatural silence. The animals in the woods had gone quiet, the wind stilled. Then came the whispers, low and eerie, like voices carried on the breeze. The green-eyed creatures emerged from the shadows, their forms flickering in and out of the darkness as they moved toward the village. John stood at the forefront, his hand resting on the hilt of the sword. He could feel its power humming beneath his fingers, but he resisted the urge to draw it. Not yet. The time would come. The creatures advanced, their leader, a figure cloaked in darkness, at the head of the pack. John's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. They had planned for this. They were ready. As the first creature crossed into the village, one of the traps was triggered. A hidden pit opened beneath its feet, and the creature tumbled in with a shriek. Another trap followed, then another, slowing the dark forces' advance as they navigated the treacherous terrain, but they kept coming, relentless in their pursuit. John gave the signal, and the villagers sprang into action. Armed with spears, bows, and anything they could find, they fought back, working together to hold the line. Elena moved with grace and precision, her spells weaving through the chaos, healing the wounded and pushing back the enemy. John's focus remained on the leader of the dark forces, the figure who watched from the shadows. He knew this was the real threat. The creatures were dangerous, but the true battle would be won or lost with their leader. Finally, the leader stepped forward, a wicked smile twisting his face. "You think you can win with your little tricks, boy?" John drew the sword of the stars, its light blazing in the darkness. "We're not afraid of you." The leader laughed, a sound that sent chills down John's spine. "You should be." With a flick of his wrist, the leader sent a wave of dark energy hurtling toward John. He barely had time to react, raising the sword just in time to deflect the blow. The force of the impact sent him stumbling back, but he regained his footing, his eyes locked on the enemy. The battle between them was fast and fierce. The leader's dark magic clashed with the sword's radiant light, each strike sending shockwaves through the air. John fought with everything he had, but the leader was powerful, more powerful than any opponent he had faced before. And then, just as it seemed the leader would overwhelm him, John remembered the lesson he had learned in the woods. The sword was strong, but it wasn't his only strength. He had something the leader didn't, the power of unity. With a quick glance, John signaled to Elena, who was fighting nearby. She nodded, understanding instantly. As John continued to engage the leader, Elena began weaving a powerful spell, drawing on the collective energy of the villagers around her. The air shimmered with magic, and John felt the surge of power as the spell took hold. At the last moment, John fainted to the side, leaving the leader exposed. Elena's spell hit its mark, a brilliant blast of light that engulfed the leader, sending him staggering back. John didn't waste a second. He charged forward, the sword of the stars glowing brighter than ever. With a single, decisive strike, he brought the blade down on the leader, cutting through the darkness that clung to him. The leader let out a scream, his form dissolving into shadow as the sword's light consumed him. And then, just like that, it was over. The remaining creatures, leaderless and disoriented, retreated into the night. The village was safe. They had won. John stood in the aftermath, the sword still glowing faintly in his hand. He was exhausted, his body aching from the battle, but there was a sense of peace settling over him. They had done it. Not just him, but all of them, together. Elena approached, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, but her eyes shining with relief. "We did it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. John smiled, nodding. "Yeah. We did." In the days that followed, the village began to rebuild. The damage from the battle was extensive, but the people worked together, just as they had fought together. There was a new sense of unity in the village, a bond forged in the fires of battle. John knew that the dark forces weren't gone for good. They would always be out there, lurking in the shadows. But for now, the village was safe. And they were stronger for it. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, John made his way back to the ancient ruin where he had first found the Sword of the Stars. He stood before the pedestal, the sword in hand, its surface gleaming in the fading light. With a deep breath, he placed the sword back on the pedestal. It was a powerful weapon, but he knew now that its true strength didn't come from the blade itself. It came from the people it inspired, the unity it fostered. John turned and walked away, the sword left behind, a symbol of a power greater than any one person. He was a farmer's son, a protector of his village, and now, a leader who understood that the greatest strength came not from a weapon, but from the hearts of those who stood together.